At this point, we're going to move on to cylindrical projections. I've reopened the fabric scene from Chapter 9, and that had the C-shaped piece of fabric that was problematic for planar projection. Planar cannot fit this convoluted shape. This would be a good candidate for cylindrical projection, however. Cylindrical projection is great for anything that's cylindrical, anything that has a curvy shape to it, or it bends around like this. So let's give that a try. I'm going to select the surface, go to Create UVs, and go to Cylindrical Mapping, which is the second mapping type. So I'll apply that. When we do that, the manipulator comes in, and it's in the shape of a partial cylinder at this point. So just like the planar mapping, you want to get this manipulator to fit your more cylindrical shape. So first thing you do is rotate this manipulator in such a way that it follows that C shape. So I'm going to try to do that through the channel box, because once the manipulator is up, I can see it in the channel box. You can also do this in the attribute editor if you want. In any case, there's a rotate attributes right here. So let's start by rotating it by 90 degrees in X. And that's closer. At least now it's still flowing in the same direction. However, it'd be great to rotate it upwards so it really corresponds to that C shape better. Now, since I rotated 90 in X, I've gotten it much closer now. At least the length is running in the same direction. Now what I can do is rotate the whole thing up so it matches better. And you can do that interactively if you want, but again, it's probably easier to try the channel box. So let's try to rotate in Z. I'm just going to put in a number and see how it works, 90 degrees in Z. And there, rotated it this way, but it's kind of the opposite of what we want. It's running this way, yet the surface is running the opposite direction. So you can enter a negative number if you want to. So I'll enter a negative 90 into Z. And that corresponds fairly well. Now to fine tune it, I think I will try to interactively rotate it. Now if you look close, you can see there's a little red line down the center. That's actually a rotation handle for that particular direction. So if I click drag that, I can fine tune the rotation. And you can see, because I have hardware texturing on, the texture updates. Now if you accidentally click off the handle and it disappears, just apply Ctrl-Z to get it back again. Sometimes it's a little finicky, so if you don't click exactly right, it might disappear. So in that case, that's pretty close. So now the checker texture is starting to make more sense here. However, because my cylindrical manipulator is too small and is smaller than my surface, I'm starting to get a repeat. So I'm getting more than 4 squares in my checker texture. I'm getting repeats along the edges. Let's take a look in the UV texture and see what that looks like. And in fact, you can see that although the layout of the faces is pretty good, it's relatively square, I still have overlap, where it's overlapping the valid area. If I turn on the texture button, I can see how some faces are definitely beyond the valid 0 to 1 area. So let's try to scale the manipulator up a little bit. So I'll hide this for a second. Now scaling is usually fairly easy with these manipulators, so I can grab the end cubes here to scale it up in different directions. So I scale it up in the Y direction here. I can see that my repeat starts to get better. If it's too small, I get a bunch of repeats. And once I just get past the edge, I get a more valid repeat that matches that texture. So scale up in the Y direction. Then I'll go over to the red cubes, which is the X direction, and scale that. Now I scale on this direction. It makes the cylinder more complete. I can go all the way around to 360 degrees if I want, if I keep going, and then it completely surrounds the object. However, since it's not a full cylinder, in other words, it's not a pipe or a tube, I don't have to go that far. I just want to go past the edge so I get no repeats. So maybe about roughly here. So now I've been able to scale and rotate my manipulator, so I pretty much have the checker appearing one time. Now it's not perfect. I can see I have an extra little white bit down here at the bottom, and this corner looks a little funny, but it's a lot closer. Let's go back to UV texture editor because we do some extra tweaking there. I can see there is some overlap here. Turn off the texture again. In particular, I can see this area down here is stretched outwards. Also looks like there's a little pinching down here at the bottom. Now in order to change the view inside the UV texture editor, I'm just using my camera keys. So Alt middle mouse button lets me scroll, and Alt right mouse button lets me dolly in. So I dolly in, I can see that indeed there's a problem down here and a problem down here. So there's only so far I can get the manipulator. In fact, this kind of pattern where there's a couple of vertices sticking way out, it's not unusual for that style of projection. The cylinder projection tends to do that. Luckily though, I can make some changes inside the editor itself to clean it up. So one thing you can do is select UVs and move them around. So let me make this window bigger so I have more room to work with. And then we'll do right mouse key. I'm going to select a UV from that right mouse menu. And then I can click drag boxes over one or more UVs. Once I'm selected as little green dots, I can go to my standard transform tools like move and move them. So what I can do then is grab one UV at a time and move them to reassemble those faces so they're not twisted and so they're not outside the valid UV texture space. Now, it might be a little hard to see what's going on initially, but as you move the UVs, you can start to see the pattern of the faces appear. And since this is all four-sided faces, I should be able to get that kind of pattern in the editor once again. So some of the faces were overlapping, so I can solve that by moving the UVs so they're no longer overlapping. I've been given too little space in the UV texture editor, so I can spread them out so they're more evenly spaced. And that's ideal, as you want your distribution of your faces in the UV texture editor to be similar to the distribution of your faces on your actual geometry in your view panel. So now I've taken care of that little skinny corner. I can also deal with this little pinched area down here at the bottom. So if I dolly in, we'll try to see what's going on there. And as soon as I move the UVs apart, we can start to see the face pattern. So there I moved the UVs around enough to give me a more logical layout down here. Now you can continue to manipulate as much as you want to try to get a nice even layout. I'm just going to do it fairly quickly here to prevent any kind of repeating of the pattern and any kind of obvious overlapping. So taking care of the bottom here, I can see what's going on with the side. I have a bit of a side sticking out here. And one thing I can do is pick a bunch of UVs at once. I can draw a box over the entire layout and move the entire layout over. So I can try to move it over to such a degree that nothing extends the edges there. Another thing you can do is scale. Once I have these all selected, I can go to my scale tool and scale these. If I scale them down a little bit in one direction, I can have everything fit within this 0 to 1 area. So now if I go back to my view panel, I can see that I don't have any weird repeating along the edges any longer. And now I have my ideal layout, which is 2 black checkers and 2 white checkers. Now, it's not perfect. If I go back to my UV texture editor, you can see that there is empty space. Now, if there's any empty space in that 0 to 1 area, that means that part of the map is not being utilized. In other words, there's a part of the checker that the surface is not using at all and will not render. So I want a perfect layout. What I do is move all of the UVs around to such a degree that they fill up this space perfectly and there's no wasted UV space. Now, that could be very time consuming, so it's not always necessary. In fact, what you need to do is just get the UV layout close enough to look good for your render and then stop. So if I felt that my checker looked good at this point, I could stop. If I wanted to make it a little bit more perfect, then I might spend more time manipulating UVs in this editor. In fact, we'll talk about more tools you can apply in this editor and more ways you can manipulate the UVs in later videos. But for now, by applying the cylindrical mapping, manipulating the manipulator, and spending a little time moving UVs in the UV texture editor, I've got a pretty nice layout. So now when I render this out, I'm getting a nice checker pattern.